ketones actually work by opening up these trapdoors, these escape valves, and wasting more calories. And so rather than becoming an efficient fat burner, you actually become a fat waster. And that's actually where weight loss comes from.
Why keto? And what role can it play in helping us live longer and live healthier?
Yeah, secretly in this Unlocking the Keto Code book is probably Longevity Paradox 2.0. It's actually a longevity book hiding in a keto book. And I think that's actually very useful information because I think most people don't necessarily think of keto as a longevity program, but in fact, the things that we can learn from the effects of ketones on our mitochondria is pretty useful information going forward. If you, like you and me, if we want to die young at a ripe old age.
Yeah, absolutely. So why, well, first off, I guess off the top, one thing that really surprised me when reading the book is that you call ketones, in fact, I believe it's one of the titles it's the title of one of your chapters, a poor fuel source.
Yep.
So that, I mean, just off the bat, that's kind of a surprising headline to read in a book that is all about apparently espousing the benefits of a keto diet.
Right.
So unpack that for me.
Well, I, among others, have advocated a ketogenic version of my diet in all my books. And I was a big keto fan, and I, kind of like everybody else, said, well, ketones make you an efficient fat burner, et cetera, and that's how you lose weight. But when I was writing The Energy Paradox, my last book, I like to back up my claims with research and document it. So I'm kind of working on where ketones fit into energy production. And so I decided to, go way back in time and look at all the original ketone research that was done at Harvard and the NIH by George Cahill and his student, Dr. Owens, and by Dr. Veach at the NIH. And lo and behold, it turns out that even though Dr. Veach became famous for saying our natural state should be starvation and that ketones are the most magnificent, perfect fuel, particularly Dr. Cahill's work and Dr. Owens' work at Harvard said, well, actually, not so fast. When they looked at humans that were in starvation and producing ketones, they found that, interestingly enough, after about 3 days of not eating, muscles preferred ketones as a fuel. But immediately after that, they shift over to burning free fatty acids as their preferred fuel. And if you look at ketosis for any length of time, it turns out that even at full ketosis, only 30% of the calorie energy needs for the body can be met by using ketones, and the rest have to come from free fatty acids and proteins and some glucose. Even the brain at full ketosis only gets 60 to 70% of its needs met by ketones, and the rest has to come from glucose. So if this was a perfect fuel, why would human studies suggest that maybe it isn't? In fact, when you compare that with Vogel's and Finney's work in ketogenic diet for athletes, they point out that it takes 3 to 4 weeks to become keto adapted to a ketogenic diet. And yet from Cahill's work, at 3 days, muscles prefer ketones as their fuel source. So one would think that if ketones were that good and the muscles were using them fully at 3 weeks, at 3 days, why would it take 3 or 4 weeks to become keto adapted? And they themselves admit that exercise performance drops and drops pretty dramatically for 3 to 4 weeks. So something's wrong with ketones are a great fuel. And yet I and others, I come to praise ketones, but I need to bury them as a great fuel source. And we need to find out, okay, if they're not a great fuel source, why do they exist? And why are there benefits of getting ketones generated? And that's the purpose of the book.
I love that. Well, I really do want to do a deep dive into the benefits that you've identified in your research. But let's take a step back, I think, because there are probably some listeners and viewers of this who are either unfamiliar with ketones and what the ketogenic diet is, or could perhaps benefit from a refresher, a crash course, if you will. So what is the ketogenic diet? And of course, what are ketones within the context of the ketogenic diet?
Sure. Ketones have been known about since the late 1800s. They were discovered in Germany, and they were detected actually in people with type 1 diabetes. And nobody really knew what to think about them. They really were not viewed as a fuel source. They were viewed maybe as a toxic byproduct. But the real interest in the ketogenic diet started in 1930 when it was learned that children with seizure disorders who had severe seizure disorders spent a lot of time post-ictal, recovering from a seizure, and they weren't eating very much. In fact, they were starving. And researchers noted, particularly in Boston at the Mayo Clinic, that these children who were starving, when they were starving, they weren't having any seizures, or their seizures dramatically decreased. Now, starving children as a treatment for epilepsy is not a good idea.
It's a hard sell.
That's a hard sell. But the Mayo Clinic said, gee, when you're starving, you're making ketones. And the only other way to make ketones, and we'll get to what they are in a second, is to basically not eat any carbohydrates or proteins and just basically eat fat. So they made a diet of 80% fat, 10% carbohydrates, and 10% proteins, and actually coined the phrase ketogenic diet. And they fed it to these kids with epilepsy. And lo and behold, these kids had dramatic reduction in their seizures. In fact, it was the standard of care for many years for childhood epilepsy. And this was before drugs like phenobarbital or Dilantin came about. Now, when Dilantin and phenobarb came out, the ketogenic diet kind of went by the wayside. But these drugs were still not perfect. And the ketogenic diet had a resurgence in actually the 80s and 90s in using a totally different fat called MCT, medium chain triglycerides, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But back to ketones. What we now know is that normally, if we all have metabolic flexibility, and that basically means the ability for our mitochondria to either use glucose as a fuel or to use free fatty acids as a fuel to generate ATP. And they can usually switch on a dime. The minute glucose runs out, you start releasing free fatty acids from fat cells, and you burn free fatty acids. And that's great. Only one problem. Free fatty acids are large fat-soluble molecules, and as you know, they do not get through the blood-brain barrier. They technically can, but it's such a slow process, and the brain is such an energy hog that they just can't supply the brain with enough fuel. So enter ketones. Luckily, ketones are generated by the liver from free fatty acids. And interestingly enough, the liver can't use ketones. And I point out in the book that one famous ketone author says the liver loves ketones. No, sorry, the liver can't use ketones. So the liver throws it out into circulation. Ketone bodies are short chain fatty acids that are water soluble. And so they have the ability to get through the brain when glucose is no longer available. So they basically act as a temporary support system for the brain and keep the brain alive, waiting for the next time you eat. And this was a brilliant survival mechanism. Obviously, every evidence is that our hunter-gatherers went through periods of feast and periods of famine. And one of the benefits of being what we call the fat ape, we're the only ape that has huge fat stores, is that we could make it through long periods of not eating or minimal eating because we could live on our fat and we could keep our brain going pretty doggone well using ketones as an alternative fuel for glucose. So that's where the idea of, where ketones come from and why ketones are actually pretty doggone important for survival mechanism. Fast forward, the ketogenic diet said, gee, when people are in this ketosis, one of the consequences seems to be weight loss. And it must be because you become an efficient fat burner. And you're so efficient at burning fat that you prefer burning fat, and that's why you lose weight. Unfortunately, that's not the reason you lose weight, and that's one of the big shockers in the book. It really has nothing to do with being an efficient fat burner. It has the opposite. You become actually an incredibly wasteful burner of fat. You actually waste fat, and that's actually why you lose weight.
You waste fat when you are fat adapted, when you're keto adapted?
Correct.
That is fascinating. So is it safe to say that your average American is never in ketosis, never experiences exposure to ketones?
Yeah, that's the bad news. Half of normal weight Americans have no metabolic flexibility. I mean, think about that for a minute. So half of us walking around with a normal weight, you and me, cannot shift to burning fat as a fuel. 50%. Now, overweight Americans, 88% of overweight Americans they're metabolically inflexible, can't make the shift. And 99.5% of obese individuals are metabolically inflexible. They cannot make the shift. And you go, holy cow, overweight and obese, that's most Americans. So most Americans can't make this shift. And that's why one of the patients I profile in the book, Miranda, was on a ketogenic diet, guided by her physician, for 2 years. And she couldn't lose weight, number one, and she actually gained weight. She gained 15 pounds during that 2 years. And when I saw her, we actually looked at fasting free fatty acids and ketone bodies in our patients. And she wasn't in ketosis, number one. And shockingly, she had an insulin level of 16, which meant she was insulin resistant. And she was apoplectic. She said, well, that's ridiculous. I've been on a ketogenic diet for 2 years. And I said, well, guess what? You've probably never been in ketosis. And, and here's why. And that's how we went into this for her. And luckily, once she understood why it wasn't working for her, she's actually done great once we changed things around.
So not only does a ketogenic diet not necessarily guarantee weight loss, but you can actually gain weight on a ketogenic diet. We're blowing the lid, I think, on a massive misconception that many people have, that ketogenic diets equal weight loss.
Correct. Here's the deal. So if a ketogenic diet made you an efficient fat burner, think about what that means. Efficiency means actually getting the most out of something. Let's use gasoline as an equivalent for fat. if I wanted to be an efficient gasoline burner, I would buy a Toyota Prius. Very efficient at getting 50 miles out of a gallon of gas. On the other hand, if I wanted to be an inefficient fat burner, gas burner, I'd buy a Ferrari. Really good at wasting gas. Now, there might be other reasons that you and I might want a Ferrari, but for the analogy, it's a really great way to waste gas. So here's the problem. As you know, and I know, fats have 9 calories per gram, carbohydrates and proteins only 4. So it's got literally more than twice the amount of calories per gram as sugar and protein, fats. So if I'm an efficient fat burner and I'm eating mostly fat, I should actually get fat. I should gain weight because I'm really efficient at using that fat. And of course, the opposite is true if you're actually getting the benefits that ketones were actually designed to do. And that's to paradoxically, love that word, should use it in a book sometime. Paradoxically, you actually are wasting fat. You become an inefficient fat burner. You turn your mitochondria into Ferraris. And that actually may be very beneficial to turn your mitochondria into Ferraris.
So is it that eating more fat makes you burn more fat?
Not necessarily so. And as I talk about in the books, fats are not fats, and there are lots of different fats with lots of different effects on mitochondria and the ability to get into ketosis. And I show in a nerdy sort of way in one chapter that fats are not fats, and you got to choose your fats carefully if you really want to get the benefits of a high fat diet. But the good news is you really don't have to follow a high fat diet to get into ketosis. And that's actually the exciting news. Because quite frankly, studies of humans show that 60% of people who embark on a ketogenic diet quit within a month. And there are multiple reasons for that. First of all, it's profoundly boring to eat, a pound of cream cheese sprinkled with cheddar cheese with a bacon chaser constantly. As I point out, some researchers from the University of Sydney in Australia have shown in animals and humans that all animals, including humans, have carbohydrate sensors, and that we have a need to sense those presence of carbohydrates. And we will fight against all odds to find carbohydrates, even on a ketogenic diet. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many people on a ketogenic diet who even are doing well go, if I don't have a piece of sourdough bread right now, I'm going to kill somebody. And I think we can all relate to that. I spent my career trying to devise a program that people can live with literally and figuratively. And, the evidence is that it's very difficult to live on a ketogenic diet long term. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very difficult diet to sustain, and that's why I think it's good to share with people that the ketogenic diet that they see promoted by their favorite Instagram guru is not something that they even need to get the body of their dreams, right? But that actually could be posing them unnecessary health risks, right?
Correct.
There's and you kind of touched on this, but there's colloquially, I mean, these are not scientific terms, but dirty keto and clean keto. Sometimes people will they'll base their diet around blocks of cheese and butter, and I see some of these meals that people post on social media, and they look horrific from the standpoint of from your vantage point, a cardiologist. I mean, you must be livid when you see, or not livid, but some of these like the ways that people practice ketogenic diets must be really shocking to you.
Well, here's the deal. I look at my patients' blood work every 3 to 6 months. And what's fascinating is I have people who get really enthusiastic about a hardcore ketogenic diet, an 80% fat diet. And they come in and they've lost weight and they feel great. And they go, man, I've never felt so good. I really felt good. I go, well, that's interesting because I want you to look at this. You know, I don't really care about LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, but I do care if your LDL is oxidized, if it's rusty or rancid, because then it really wants to stick to blood vessels. And I really care whether blood vessels themselves are sticky. And we can measure the stickiness of blood vessels, how attractive they are to cholesterol. And I really care about how flexible people's blood vessels are. There's a saying in longevity that you're only as young as your blood vessels are flexible. And so here, I've had 3 recently. And they all, man, I feel great. And they're all guys and they're all, buff and they're really good. But their LDL has gone up 100 points. And what's worse is their oxidized LDL, which was perfectly fine, is now glowing bright red that it's now oxidized. And the stickiness of their blood vessels, which had always been pristine, is now highly sticky. And their blood vessels, which had always been beautifully flexible, are now stiff as boards. And they go, but. And I said, look, I'm glad you feel great. And that's wonderful. But look what's happening. You're basically that young swimmer swimming in the water from Jaws, and there's a great white shark underneath coming up that is about to bite you. And you're unaware of it, but I can see it. And so here, you're having a great time, but there's a great white shark about to take a bite out of your brain or your heart. And they go, holy cow. And we see this all the time. And one of the reasons I see this is because the standard clean keto diet is virtually void of fiber, of fibrous plants. And it's virtually void of polyphenols, which maybe we'll get into. And so they've eliminated taking care of the real important people in them, and that is their microbiome, their gut buddies. And without prebiotic fiber and without polyphenols, the microbiome can't produce the compounds that we now know stop the oxidation of LDL, stop the stickiness of blood vessels. And I've published studies about this in humans, and make blood vessels flexible. And it's all gone. So I have nothing wrong with a short-term hardcore keto diet, but this is not a diet for life. I can assure anyone who's listening. Sorry about that.
What are some of those gut fermentation byproducts that support arterial flexibility, reduce risk of oxidized LDL?
Yeah, so that was really the subject of my last book, and I reprise it in Unlocking the Keto Code. They're postbiotics. And for many people, that's a brand new word. Most people know probiotics, which is the friendly bacteria. A lot of people now know prebiotics, which are these fibers that friendly bacteria eat. But friendly bacteria eat these prebiotics because they make postbiotic. There's 2 types of postbiotics. One are short-chain fatty acids. Butyrate is the most famous. Butter, believe it or not, gets its name from butyric acid, butyrate. There's a little bit of butyrate in butter, but not so much that Dave Asprey would ever get a benefit from. And as you know, he's a friend.
We won't share that with him.
I've told it to his face, and we have a good laugh. And the other thing, acetate, acetic acid, vinegar. is a postbiotic, which is a short chain fatty acid. But there are gases that these bacteria make. So hydrogen gas being one of them. Hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell, is actually incredibly important for vascular health. And I show in the book that the right amount of hydrogen sulfide actually prevents atherosclerosis, but too much can actually foster it. So you have to find that sweet spot. Methane gas is actually a very important postbiotic, as is carbon dioxide, which is the major gas in our gut. So all of these things, we know that hydrogen, the famous Parkinson's study in Japan, where they looked at people with Parkinson's disease and looked at whether their gut microbiome made hydrogen gas. And lo and behold, people with Parkinson's made very little hydrogen gas. They didn't have the microbiome to make it, whereas normal people had plenty of hydrogen gas producing bacteria. So in the study, they gave people with Parkinson's hydrogen water, hydrogen dissolved in water, and had them drink it multiple times a day. And lo and behold, their symptoms of Parkinson's got less just by introducing a postbiotic gas. So we're getting to know that there's this incredibly important language between the gut microbiome and our mitochondria that's completely lost when we stop feeding these guys what they need to eat.
So I'm hearing all the benefits of these gases, but Dr. Gundry, it sucks to be gassy. So how do we reconcile everything that you're saying without walking around and feeling like we're an inflated balloon?
Well, first of all, as I said in the last book, step on the gas. It turns out that you will become adapted to breaking down these prebiotic fibers, so that it's just a temporary feeling. But there's other ways to do it. So, for instance, I think one of the most exciting things is we can get the benefit of bacterial fermentation by using vinegars, fermented foods. The benefit of the fermented foods, it turns out, is not in the probiotic bacteria that are in fermented foods, but it's actually in the postbiotic compounds that are in fermented foods, like, for instance, the vinegars and other short-chain fatty acids. There was a beautiful study out of Stanford last year that actually confirmed that the benefits of fermented foods was actually in increasing the diversity of the microbiome by giving them the compounds that they needed, and that fermented foods actually decreased inflammation in human volunteers much better than just prebiotic fiber by themselves. And that's because you're already ingesting preformed postbiotics. So one of the great hacks that I talk about in the book is anytime you can use vinegar, like the miracle of apple cider vinegar is actually in these postbiotic compounds that the apple cider vinegar brings. Same way with balsamic vinegar. Anytime you can get balsamic vinegar, apple cider vinegar, take some of your sparkling water, throw a tablespoon, a couple in, you're going to have a fantastic, refreshing drink, and you'll do two wonderful things simultaneously.
I love that. Apple cider vinegar also great to minimize the glycemic impact of starches when consumed concurrently.
Yep.
Love that. Okay. So, wow, we've covered so much already, but getting back to becoming a better fat burner and becoming more metabolically flexible. So what's the secret then? What is the secret to becoming a less efficient fat burner?
Well, so this gets into what's called mitochondrial uncoupling. And believe me, I did not invent the word. I wouldn't have invented that word. But mitochondrial uncoupling was first described actually when the electron transport chain in mitochondria was finally accepted from 1978. Sir Peter Mitchell got the Nobel Prize for describing the electron transport chain. Let me make it very simple. I go through a real fun way in the book talking about the Mito Club, which is the hippest, hottest, neatest place to be. And people go there to couple. You want to find someone to couple with. Now, uncoupling sounds like my friend Gwyneth Paltrow's divorce. She uncoupled from her marriage. But in fact, we're supposed to, in mitochondria, to produce ATP, couple oxygen with protons, and in the process of coupling, leaving the mitochondria, you produce ATP as a part of that part of that coupling. But making ATP is really damaging to mitochondria. Things couple with things they shouldn't be. Electrons couple with oxygen molecules and really shouldn't be. And that makes reactive oxygen species, free radicals. And most people now know those are really damaging to mitochondria. And things are hot and steamy and really pressurized in the Mito Club, in the mitochondria, and it's hard work. So just like a pressure cooker, you need a pop-off valve to release the pressure in pressure cookers when things are getting too dangerous. My mother blew up a pressure cooker when I was growing up. It's very exciting. It was all over the scene.
Impressive. Wow.
It was very impressive. I still remember it. So we've got these pop-off valves. And it turns out that mitochondria, to relieve the pressure, if you will, of making ATP, have 5 different emergency exits in the Mito Club, 5 emergency pop-off valves. And they're controlled by proteins that are called uncoupling proteins. And the object of the game is to prevent damage to mitochondria. Now, amazingly enough, you and I sitting here, 30% of all the energy, all the calories going into our mitochondria are uncoupled from making ATP in our mitochondria. They're released via back doors, these emergency exits. 30%. Now you think about it, Max, what a dumb design that we literally waste 30% of the calories we eat to protect our mitochondria. It's that important. What do we do with those wasted calories? We actually generate heat, and we're a warm-blooded animal. Even, interestingly enough, cold-blooded animals actually have to maintain a temperature, and so they're actually uncoupled as well, but not as vigorously as animals, mammals. So we waste a huge amount of calories already. So imagine if things are getting really tough, we even open up more floodgates to waste even more energy. And it turns out that ketones actually work by opening up these trapdoors, these escape valves, and wasting more calories. And so rather than becoming an efficient fat burner, you actually become a fat waster. And that's actually where weight loss comes from.
Fascinating. So ketones in the form of, ketones, whether derived from a ketogenic diet, which is essentially a starvation mimicking diet,
correct,
or ketogenic fats like medium chain triglycerides, all
correct,
have this effect?
Yeah, the brilliance is when it was discovered that medium chain triglycerides are unlike any fat in that they are absorbed directly through the wall of the gut. They don't need a transport molecule called chylomicrons. They go directly through the portal vein into the liver. And in the liver, they're converted into ketones, regardless of what else you're eating. Now, think of the implications of that. And the mind boggles, but I could tell someone to have a fresh fruit salad, and you know me, I would never tell anybody to have a fresh fruit salad, but we won't go that direction. And have a tablespoon of MCT oil, you will actually generate ketones, even though you ate a high carbohydrate meal, just because you had MCTs. Now, that's why the MCT-based anti-seizure diet actually worked so well because they could give kids a lot more carbohydrates and a lot more proteins, and it became a very palatable way to get a kid to eat food. But we can get that same benefit. The great benefit is, unfortunately, the vast majority of people, because they have high insulin levels and because they're not metabolically flexible, they can't generate ketones for weeks and weeks doing a ketogenic diet because their insulin levels prevent fat release from fat cells. Insulin blocks a hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase from being expressed. Hormone-sensitive lipase. Gee, I wonder what hormone-sensitive lipase is sensitive to. Insulin. Mm-hmm. So when insulin's up, which would store fat, normally you wouldn't want fat to come out. So insulin blocks this hormone-sensitive lipase. When insulin falls, then hormone-sensitive lipase liberates fat out of fat stores as free fatty acids. Since most people have elevated insulin levels and are metabolically inflexible, you could literally go on a ketogenic diet and wait weeks and weeks to actually begin to liberate free fatty acids. And this has actually been shown, if you look at the literature and dive into it deeply, in a low-carb ketogenic diet versus a normal carb diet for weight loss. And several of these studies, using actually hundreds of people, have shown that the basal metabolic rate, the fat burning rate, if you will, takes about 3 to 4 weeks on a low-carb diet to begin to start wasting fat, burning fat as a fuel. And until you get to that point, you're not going to really have much effect because you're really actually not generating ketones because it takes a long time for your insulin levels to fall. And that's what's so frustrating about starting a ketogenic diet, because without ketone generation, your brain goes, what the heck? What have I got to eat around here? I'm literally starving to death. And, you get the Atkins blue or the keto flu, your athletic performance drops. I have a bunch of athletes who try a ketogenic diet and they just, come back after a week. This sucks. I can't lift half the weight. I can't go on the treadmill longer. I'm leaving this. And so that's one of the big problems with the ketogenic diet.
So there seems to be a hunger suppressing effect and a metabolic advantage to being in ketosis. Is this why in your estimation it's beneficial to be on a ketogenic diet as opposed to a non-ketogenic diet, but a diet that places one into a calorie deficit? Because I guess what I'm trying to ask is, we know that a calorie deficit is the key to lose weight, and you can be ingesting any combination of macronutrients, so long as you're in a calorie deficit.
That's one way.
That's one way, right?
But there's a better way.
Okay, so expound on that a little bit, because people on a ketogenic diet, if they're in a calorie surplus, as you mentioned, they're still going to gain weight, correct?
They do gain weight, except. So the best study, and I go into the nuances of why ketones exert a beneficial weight loss effect. But the best study was done with Italian athletes, Italian cyclists, and they were put on a training table for 3 months where everybody had to eat the exact same food, and they had to finish their plates at every meal. They were divided into 2 groups based on the timing of their meals. One group went on a 12-hour eating schedule where they ate breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning, they ate lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had to finish dinner by 8 o'clock at night, a 12-hour eating window. The other group of athletes had the same food. They went on a 7-hour window. They had breakfast at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They had lunch at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had to finish dinner at 8 o'clock at night. Same amount of calories. Calories in, calories out, right? Nope. the group that had a compressed eating window to 7 hours lost weight, even though they were eating the same calories as the 12-hour guys. And the group in the 7-hour eating window dramatically lowered their insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, which is still the best blood measurement for whether mTOR is activated or not. They had equal athletic performance. It didn't suffer. So even though they were all eating the same calories, it was the compression of the eating window. So what happened? Well, it turns out that, as I mentioned before, if we have metabolic flexibility, we start making ketones after about 8 hours after stopping eating. And we really ramp up to ketone production at 12 hours. But so the athletes on the 12-hour eating window, they were just starting to ramp up ketone production, and then they started eating, and that stopped their ketones. The other guys, they were ramping up their ketone production at 12 hours, but then they added another 5 hours of making ketones before they stopped ketone production. So they had an additional 5 hours of ketones telling mitochondria to waste fuel. And this has actually been done in studies with MCT oil-based diets versus olive oil diets. And even in humans, people who got MCT oil instead of olive oil, equal calories, had a 3 to 5 kilogram weight loss advantage to having the same calories as olive oil. And you know me, the only purpose of food is to get olive oil into your mouth, right? But they had even equal calories. The fact that MCTs were turning into ketones, they were uncoupling their mitochondria and wasting fuel. So a calorie is not a calorie where ketones are concerned. And we can use that in the book. If I hold your hand, and I don't want you tomorrow, folks, to have your first meal at noon. Most people fall flat on their face. But if I ask you, okay, if you eat breakfast at 7 o'clock, next week, let's eat breakfast at 8 o'clock. Come on, 1 hour. That's all I ask for you. We'll do that for 5 days, and then we'll take the weekend off. And believe it or not, there's beautiful human studies that weekends don't count in this regimen. The next week, come on, we're going to go to 9 o'clock. That's only an hour more than last week, which you were able to do. And each week, over 5 weeks, we hold your hand and we get to noon as the time you start eating. And then we ask you to stop eating at 7 o'clock or adjust accordingly. And so you'll become this fat waster in no time. And it'll be actually remarkably easy. And you don't have to follow a high-fat diet to achieve it.
It's amazing. So it sounds like it's not necessarily refuting the energy balance model of obesity. It just sounds like you're boosting the calories outside of the equation.
That's exactly right. You're literally wasting them. They do not contribute to ATP production. Now, that sounds stupid, but as I talk about in the book, one of the papers that really changed my whole way of looking at this is there's a researcher by the name of Martin Brand. And in 2000, he wrote a paper called Uncoupling to Survive. Simple title. It's actually a very simple paper. And what he proposed, and it's since been confirmed by many researchers, is if you're starving to death, and let's face it, ketones were produced in starvation. That's why they exist. If you're starving to death and your mitochondria don't make it, you're dead. That's it. So mitochondria should protect themselves at all costs from dying. They should protect themselves at all costs. They should repair themselves and do anything they can do not to damage themselves. And we know that making ATP is really damaging. So he proposed that in extremis, ketones are a signaling system to tell mitochondria, okay, everybody from the cells, you got to save yourself at all costs. And the way to do it is don't hurt your cells making energy and just throw a lot of the calories away and protect your cells. Now, you sit there and go, wait a minute, if you're starving to death, you need every last little calorie. That makes no sense. But paradoxically, it actually makes sense because the mitochondria have to protect themselves. But part two of the equation is when mitochondria are stressed and getting ketones, they're told to make more of themselves, mitogenesis, to carry the workload. And that's really the key of what he was talking about. And I use the example, let's suppose we're on a dog sled and we have one dog. That dog can pull us not very well, and he doesn't eat very much. But if we want to make it the long term, we ought to get a sled of 6 dogs. Each dog will do 1/6 the work of the single dog, and they'll go a whole lot farther with one catch. You now have to feed 6 dogs instead of 1 dog. So they're actually going to burn through more calories in an effort to keep each dog working less. And so it turns out it's actually a brilliant design. The more you stimulate mitochondria with ketones to protect themselves and work less, the more they make more of themselves to share the workload. And the more sharing of the workload with less individual stress means you're going to win the Iditarod every time. You're going to go a very long time.
Wow. Cool. So cool. Okay. So you've talked about the benefits of curtailing your last meal of the day and having an earlier dinner if feasible, if possible. But walk me through a day of eating in accordance with unlocking the Keto Code and everything that we know about reconciling everything that you've just shared with my audience with what we know about gut health and reaping the most postbiotics that we can from our foods. What does a day of eating look like for you?
Well, for me,
or on this plan, on this plan.
Oh, on this plan. So what I want to do is slowly step people down to somewhere between a 6 to 8 hour window of eating. If they want to go crazy like I do, we'll do an OMAD diet, 1 meal a day. And I've written about this. This is, I think, my 22nd year of from January through June eating 1 meal a day during the week. I eat all my calories between 6 and 8 o'clock at night. Should I eat them between 4 and 6 o'clock at night? Yes, but my wife and I aren't home, until about 6, and it's kind of when we have dinner, and that's when we do it. Should I really do it? Maybe at noon to 2 o'clock? Yeah, but that's impractical because then I would watch my wife eat at night. That's kind of dumb. So I've been doing that for 22 years, and I take time off on the weekends like I have people do, and that it works. 22 years of it. It works.
Impressive.
No problem. But Dr. Masson from the NIH has also shown that probably the perfect window of eating is about 6 hours. Once you get to 12 hours, things don't work out like the Italian athletes did. But the more I can, and most Americans, as I've talked about in other books, eat 16 hours a day, literally from sun up to sundown. We're constantly eating. And no wonder we have no metabolic flexibility. That's number one. Number two, we're asking mitochondria to do work a very long time, and they need to rest. Our gut, believe it or not, needs to rest. Digestion is really energy intensive and very damaging to the gut wall. The longer you have contact working the gut wall, the more opportunity you have for damage, and the less opportunity you have to repair the gut wall. So there's a lot of good reasons that our design was never to eat constantly during the day. And we know from modern hunter-gatherers that breakfast it's like, what is breakfast? There's no bowl of oatmeal in the cupboard. They have to find breakfast. There's no storage systems. And they usually find breakfast 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. And that's when they break their fast.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, breakfast, it's a modern construct, right?
Oh yeah.
Probably drilled into our collective brains by cereal companies.
Absolutely. And there's pretty cool evidence that cereal companies were the main driver of this breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Yikes. So I take it that it's a lower carbohydrate diet, but one that is not deprived of microbiota accessible carbohydrates, aka dietary fiber, which
Right.
you touched on as being quite beneficial.
Right. Yeah, it's that's really one of the three pillars of the plan. It's reducing your eating window. It's making sure that the carbohydrates you eat are number one, loaded with soluble fiber, and number two, that the carbohydrates you eat are polyphenol laden carbohydrates. And polyphenols, it turns out, are these plant compounds that give the vivid colors to plant fruits, to plant leaves. The beautiful fall colors are actually the polyphenols in those leaves that we now see when the chlorophyll goes away from the leaves. So all those bright colors are the polyphenols. And we know that polyphenols are actually used by plant mitochondria, which are called chloroplasts, to protect them from the damage of sunlight. Sunlight is very damaging to plants. Plants need photons to generate energy. They're the equivalent of protons for us. And we need oxygen to generate energy, and oxygen is very damaging to us. So plants use polyphenols to protect themselves. It turns out they work by uncoupling the plant's mitochondria. Son of a gun. So when we eat polyphenols, two things happen. They're actually prebiotics to our gut bacteria. The gut bacteria, in turn these polyphenols into accessible compounds that then uncouple our mitochondria. So I keep hearing the circle of life from the Disney movie, The Lion King. We eat plants and then we feed the plants. And there's obviously a pretty cool grand design in all this. But yeah, so we have to have the plants that we do eat, the carbohydrates that we do eat, should be focused on eating the rainbow. And so when we think of eating the rainbow, it turns out that advice is actually to get in mitochondrial uncoupling polyphenols in our diet every day.
What are some of your favorite polyphenol-rich plants?
Well, I'm actually drinking a polyphenol-rich plant. I'm having tea right now. Tea is loaded with polyphenols.
That's a massive cup. That's like, I don't know if it's the angle. It's bigger than your head.
It is a large cup. Well, it's pretty big.
No, okay. So it was a weird perspective thing.
Yeah, and I get about 3 of these giant cups each with about 5 different bags of tea in it per day, and I've been doing that for many years just to uncouple my mitochondria. Coffee, the studies in brain health and coffee. People who have 5 cups of coffee a day have dramatic reduction in Parkinson's and dementia compared to people who drink less coffee. And that's because coffee actually has 2 mitochondrial uncouplers, not only the polyphenols in coffee, but also caffeine. And caffeine is a great mitochondrial uncoupler. And that's why one of the things that happens when people have a cup of coffee, even it might be an iced coffee, they notice that they get hot. They might even get a little glistening on their forehead because they're actually thermogenic compounds. And they're thermogenic because you're wasting calories and creating heat. Cool. Dark chocolate, who knew? Great mitochondrial uncoupler. But all of the dark, green vegetables, the colorful vegetables, like get yourself some Swiss chard. Perfect. It's a great mitochondrial uncoupler.
Dr. Gundry, did you see the recent study that showed that caffeine is a natural PCSK9 inhibitor?
Yes, indeed.
Why don't you? You're the cardiologist here. Why don't you unpack that for the audience? Because I thought it was so cool.
Yeah, so caffeine actually is the PCSK9 inhibitor that the new Repatha drugs work on, injectable drugs, to prevent LDL, to prevent LDL receptors from forming. So caffeine will actually lower your LDLs and get you more of the type of LDLs you want. So why get an injection? Just have, several cups of coffee per day. Boom.
I love that, especially for ApoE4 carriers who are thought to be poor LDL recyclers, right?
Correct. Yeah. And so I've been trying to get my ApoE4 folks who, constitute a big part of my practice to, get their caffeine. And coffee is a great way. Tea does have caffeine. It has other compounds instead, but tea definitely is a way to get caffeine into your diet.
You know that's how I first, well before you were a multi-platinum New York Times bestselling author, that's how I originally found out about your work, right? Because you became very popular in the ApoE4 community,
right?
Which was something that I discovered through my journey with my mom and the dementia that she had.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got interested in the ApoE4 gene as a heart surgeon and cardiologist because it's a very, good predictor of developing heart disease, cerebral vascular disease. And I really wanted to find out, why is this and what can I do about it? Little did I know, I knew Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's now become a good friend of mine, came at it from a neurologist standpoint. And, I would just glom onto his work. And a number of years ago, we were introduced at a meeting, and Dr. Bredesen, this is Dr. Gundry, this is Dr. Bredesen. And Dr. Bredesen says, Dr. Gundry, big fan. I go, really? He said, oh, your work is fantastic. Oh my gosh, I'm, so honored. I know every paper you've ever written, bow down to the God. And we've had good friendship ever since. When we send each other papers, did you know this? No, I didn't know that. Oh, thanks. So, yeah. And I was talking to David Perlmutter a few weeks ago, and I said, isn't it hilarious that two neurologists and a heart surgeon cardiologist would meet down in the gut and realize that, all our specialties are intertwined because, humbling as it is, the gut is actually where all of this is happening. And Hippocrates said it best 2,500 years ago that all disease begins in the gut. And the guy was right.
It's so true. With regard to, dementia prevention, obviously keto is of particular relevance, right, to people concerned about brain health. Is there anything that you discovered while writing Unlocking the Keto Code that perhaps surprised you, or that reaffirmed existing beliefs that you had about diet and its relation to Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia?
Well, I think it's multifactorial. I think Dr. Bredesen and I agree that amyloid actually comes from the gut. It starts by coming out of the gut. It's formed by the microbiome, and it leaks through leaky gut. And that is actually where amyloid comes from in the first place. But in answer to your question about where do ketones fit in all this, we know that mitochondrial flexibility in neurons is critical for neurons to function properly. And getting our neurons back to a state where they can actually use ketones as a fuel is critical for several reasons. It turns out that ketones uncouple neuron mitochondria, and it generates heat. And it turns out something that really surprised me, neurons love high temperatures. They operate at a much higher temperature than normal. And so if you generate heat around neurons, they're actually going to do much better. And I think that explains some of the PET scans showing that MCT oil and ketosis actually improves the activity on a PET scan in the brain. And people have said, see, that means the neurons are using this as a preferential fuel. No, what that means is there's more burning of calories by neurons, and they're generating heat. And we're picking up that increased metabolic activity, not from the fact that they're burning ketones as a preferred fuel, but they're actually generating heat that we pick up, on the PET scans as increased activity of burning calories. So the other thing I think is fascinating that I go into, and we obviously, as you know, we cut lots of things that all of us would have wanted to keep in the book. But it's interesting that CO2 is actually very important for neuron health. And I notice you're having sparkling water, and I drink San Pellegrino, and you have another one, which is also very good. But it turns out the CO2 from carbonated beverages, actually CO2 has a direct effect on improving neuron function in our brain. So, wow, want another good reason to have, some sparkling water with the addition of some apple cider vinegar or balsamic vinegar? It's a 1-2 punch.
But isn't CO2 a waste product? I mean, we exhale it, right?
Yeah, but it turns out raising our CO2, learning how to conscious breathing, is actually the secret of Buddhists and Wim Hof. That when they raise their CO2, they uncouple their mitochondria, and that uncoupling generates heat. That's why a Buddhist monk can dry a sopping wet towel or can melt snow just by meditating, because he's actually raising his CO2, which is uncoupling his mitochondria. So all these great breath holding techniques actually come down to just one thing, and that's uncoupling mitochondria. And as I say in the book, the more you uncouple your mitochondria by all these different techniques, the longer you're going to live, and the longer you're going to live well. And that's what you and I want, I think.
Absolutely. So how much MCT oil are you chugging on a day-to-day basis?
So what I try to get people to do is get about 3 tablespoons of MCT oil into their diet. And you got to start slow for women. Women, MCT oil can cause nausea. It can cause loose bowels and even diarrhea. So you got to start with maybe a teaspoon. Women in my practice do much better with powdered MCT powders than they do with oils. And the good news is there's plenty of MCT powders on the market now. They're easy to find. And they're easy to mix into coffee, for instance. And there are many coffee creamers that use MCT. So that's easy to do. If we're really trying to get people to tolerate the time period where they'll begin to release free fatty acids from their fat, you may need MCT oil multiple times a day or MCT powders. Personally, I have my own powder, MCT Wellness from Gundry MD, which has 5 grams of MCT, which I have every morning. I also take MCT oil about 3 times a day. And again, why wouldn't I? Because we know that just the very eating of MCT oil, drinking of MCT, will actually cause weight loss by uncoupling mitochondria. So why not?
And you get all those beneficial signaling.
That's what you do.
Benefits.
You want ketone signaling. And there's so many other ways to get the same signaling ability of ketones, and that's unlocking the Keto Code. Once you understand what ketones are really doing, then there's lots of ways to duplicate the effect of ketones. And so it becomes additive.
Love it. Well, your new book, Unlocking the Keto Code, is packed with details. And God, there's so many other questions that I wanted to ask you. Okay, before we go, what's your take? Because this is sort of a hot button topic these days in nutrition spheres. Your take on polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Well, I know a lot of my friends and colleagues want to throw polyunsaturated fats under the bus, and not so fast, as I talk about in the book. We have to realize that polyunsaturated fats like linoleic acid and linolenic acid, the short chain omega-6 and short chain omega-3, respectively, are essential fatty acids. Now, the word essential means we absolutely positively have to have them in our diet because we do not manufacture them. And they're essential because they are major components of not only cell membranes, but more importantly, the mitochondrial membranes and the intermitochondrial membranes. So we have to have them in our diet. But is the excessive amount of particularly linoleic acid the problem? Well, there's some really good work that I show in the book that they've been guilty by association with their combination with the sugars in our diet, particularly high fructose corn syrup. And if you take away the sugar, it turns out that these guys aren't damaging at all. They are, in fact, essential. And I think one of the best studies that has ever been done that doesn't get the love it deserves is the Leon heart diet. Some people call it the lion heart diet. And in the Lyon, it was done in Lyon, France. And they took people with known heart disease who had had a heart attack, and they randomized them to a Mediterranean diet with additional alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, a large amount of it that they basically got from canola oil, in that case, rapeseed oil, or the American Heart Association low-fat diet. And it was supposed to run for 6 years. The study was stopped after 3 years because the group getting the ALA had such better results that it was unethical to continue the study. So these folks were followed for the additional 5 years. But what's fascinating is people wanted to know, well, what was the factor in this diet that made the difference? Was it the Mediterranean diet? What was it? The only factor, after controlling for every other factor that you could control for, was the amount of alpha-linolenic acid in the bloodstream of the participants that made the difference. So then you go, wow, this is an essential fatty acid. It's in flaxseed oil. It's in organic canola oil. It's in rapeseed oil. What's the deal? Why is it working? Turns out it's an amazing mitochondrial uncoupler. So unbeknownst to anybody, this essential fatty acid was one of the key factors that made this work. So let's not throw these guys under the bus. They are guilty by guilt by association. Let's throw sugar under the bus where it belongs. But let's not think too unkindly of essential fats.
Of course not. Now, do you think that these effects were due to the fact that alpha-linoleic acid is an omega-3 fatty acid?
Yeah, but remember, we have a horrible system for converting long-chain omega-3 fats short-chain omega-3 fats into long-chain fats. And I take care of a large number of vegans and vegetarians, and they have just horrible omega-3 indexes, which look at 2 months of DHA and EPA in your bloodstream. And they're having huge amounts of flaxseed oil with no effect. We're not a fish, unfortunately. So no, it was actually the effect. It is a short chain omega-3 fat, but we have to have short chain omega-3 fats, and we have to have short chain omega-6 fats. They're essential. And recently, and I talk about this in the book, there's a new essential fatty acid, which we don't have time to talk about. It's called C15, and it is an odd chain fat found primarily in dairy products that's now been identified as an essential fatty acid that nobody knew about. And it may explain why in the Framingham Heart Study, which is the longest ongoing heart study now, I think it's in the 3rd or 4th generation of families. One of the fascinating things is that several fats in dairy products, including C15, were identified as one of the most important factors predicting long-term heart health. Dairy fats, for God's sake. Boy, have we come full circle.
I'm actually very in favor of dairy fat, especially lately these days after all the
Yep, goat and sheep, folks, and you'll see why. Because believe it or not, 30% of the fats in goat and sheep milk are MCTs.
Fascinating. You
Cool.
also get a nice hit of vitamin K2, metaclinones, which are
yes, you do. Vitamin K2 is really important, and you get some C15 and C17 in these dairy fats.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one. Can you give us some examples of disease states that are associated with too much angiogenesis, the growth, the unchecked growth of too many blood vessels, and maybe some disease states that are the result of not enough angiogenesis?
Yeah. Well, listen, our circulation is one of the very first things that form our bodies when we're in the womb. So number one, it's sort of like there's a blueprint for all the blood vessels that need to form. That's how we know, like in an anatomy text, where the aorta is and all the blood vessels. And that's how surgeons know where to go and where not to go. And the body keeps that pattern in a perfect state of balance. It's kind of like Leonardo drew that blueprint, and it's going to be that way. And the body knows how to actually prune away extra blood vessels and grow new ones where they're needed. So we've got what I call the Goldilocks zone. Like the three bears, not too hot, not too cold, but just right. We have just the right number of blood vessels, not too many and not too few. Now, here's the I think the eye-opening part, the light bulb in your head going off. So when your body is unable to prune away, mow the lawn, and get rid of those extra blood vessels, what do you think they do? Your healthy tissues don't need them. So those extra, the overage, goes to feed disease cells. So what are some of the diseases? Breast cancer, colon cancer, brain tumors, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer. In fact, every single cancer, including blood cancers, are angiogenesis or blood vessel dependent. These blood vessels feed the cancer. And so now we've actually found ways to actually starve the cancer by cutting off the blood supply. Another disease with extra blood vessels is arthritis. The blood vessels that grow extra in our joints bring enzymes that destroy the joints. Psoriasis is another disease. And then actually, as people get older, when we get into our 60s and 70s and older, and people are living longer these days, and sometimes living with chronic diseases, it turns out that a cause of vision loss for aging, macular degeneration, age-related macular degeneration, you probably know someone, a parent, a relative, a parent of a friend. That's the most common cause of blindness in this country. And people who are under 60, diabetes is a common cause. And what is causing that blindness, vision loss? Blood vessels that are growing in the eye out of control, that the body hasn't mowed down so that we have just the right amount. That overage, those vessels leak. And when blood leaks in your eye, game over. And so there are medicines that actually have been developed to really halt this in its tracks. Remarkably, in a small percentage of people, you can reverse lost vision. So you can actually put somebody who can't drive, you can put them back in the seat of a car, which is amazing. But again, what could we do with food using the same principles to prevent that, or prevent cancer, or prevent arthritis? And another exciting frontier that's extra blood vessels is Alzheimer's disease, because even the German scientist who discovered Alzheimer's disease found abnormal blood vessels growing in the brains of people with dementia. And so what we now know is that you've got to kind of mow down and get rid of all those bad blood vessels to make room for new, fresh, good blood vessels to grow back. So, this is an area of medical breakthroughs that are fueling new treatments and new hope for people. I'm involved with that, but I'm even more excited by the possibility of prevention, and not just possibility, but the reality of being able to prevent these diseases with a healthy diet.
Oh, well, I love that. And I love the concept of food as medicine, which I know you talk a lot about. So let's dive in. You mentioned off the top that there are some misconceptions about how to eat healthily, that, I detected a little bit of frustration in your tone. Let's start there. What would you say are some misconceptions, the biggest myths that people have about food as it relates to our health?
Yeah, so I'm a scientist. And so the way that I navigate my life is really by looking at the science, which builds on itself. And if you focus on facts and you focus on new discoveries, it's easier for someone like me by focusing on the facts to sort of not get bogged down, distracted, or confused by all the stuff that's floating out there that might not be anchored in facts or data. That said, what you're asking is, what are some of these common myths about food and health? Well, the first thing that I think that's a important myth to bust is that in order to eat healthy, you have to cut stuff out of your life, right? That's the thing that bums the people out the most. That's the thing that makes diets unsustainable, because human nature abhors deprivation. When somebody tells you you can't do something, your brain automatically triggers this switch that says, well, maybe just once or maybe more, right? So I've, again, sort of tried to flip that discussion around to say, could we actually add foods to our diet? What foods should we add? Because if we can focus on the foods that are supported by science, that help us prevent disease and lower disease, ameliorate diseases, help treat diseases, frankly, that's food as medicine, then we're actually doing something positive. So that's the first myth, is you got to remove everything that you love. I would tell you that the opposite is true. You can actually add food that you love. And my motto, by the way, is love your food to love your health, because that's what you want to line up. Those are the two sites that you want to line up when you're actually staring at your dinner plate. So that's one big myth. And then there's a ton of these, urban legends that are floating around about individual foods like tomatoes and soybeans and, grapes and all kinds of stuff like that. And I'm happy to kind of tackle those. It's kind of like I'm in a batter's. I'm standing in a batter's box, and you can throw them at me, and I can try to hit them out of the park for you.
Yeah, it's like a game of whack-a-mole, right? Like every week, it seems like there's another new food that's being demonized by some tribe in the nutrition space online. Tomatoes, you mentioned, lectins, right? They contain lectins, and so there are some people that will say that tomatoes are the root cause, and foods, other lectin-containing foods, are the root cause of conditions like cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, and here's where the science is. So lectins are a natural substance that our body has. It's not just a bad guy in a plant. Our body's filled with lectins, and lectins are not one kind of negative thing. There are hundreds and maybe thousands of lectins that are out there. Lectins actually are important as the glue that holds one thing together. So it's kind of part of the Elmer's glue that holds plants and people together. And yes, absolutely, some well-intentioned person identify the fact that there are some lectins that are actually very, very deadly and poisonous. Like if you eat them, you'll die. However, those are not the lectins in a tomato, or a kidney bean. And so again, I think that what I'm trying to do as a scientist is bring clarity to the message. And so what I'm just telling you now is that, yeah, it is true. There are some lectins that are not so good for you, but actually they're not the ones that are in a tomato. And so I think this is sort of like an overinterpretation, good, well-intentioned people trying to do their best to connect the dots. But because lectins are so common, it's the wrong dots to connect. So tomatoes, if you want to really know the evidence, right? Like what's the human evidence? You got to look at clinical trials. And this is something that, I'm really comfortable eating and breathing, because when you're doing drug development and developing new breakthrough medicines, you have to do clinical trials. So I'm happy to talk about them. There's a study of 30,000 men studied over 20 years. It's called the Health Professional Follow-Up Study that looked at how many tomatoes that people ate over a period of time. And it turns out that men who ate 2 to 3 servings of cooked tomatoes, how big is a serving? It's a half a cup of tomato sauce or salsa, okay, lowered the risk in this group of humans studied by almost 30%, 29% of prostate cancer.
Wow.
Right. And for the people that wound up going on to develop prostate cancer, when they biopsied the tumor, so, I'm getting into medical speak now, right? But this is where the evidence is. You biopsy the prostate cancer, you look at it under the microscope, and then you count the blood vessels, because like tomatoes contain lycopene. Lycopene cuts off the blood supply to tumors, kind of like that lawnmower that help right size your circulation, prevents tumors from getting blood vessels. So that even the people who developed prostate cancer, because tumors require blood vessels to grow, guess what? The more tomato sauce that these men who developed prostate cancer ate, the fewer the blood vessels, the less aggressive the cancer. And so this has now been borne out by many different studies. And even for women, there's about a 20% lowering of the risk of breast cancer for the same reason. So lycopene is not the only thing in a tomato, but it is one of the things that has been scientifically studied.
Do you know if that's true for all carotenoids? Because you mentioned that angiogenesis is involved in age-related macular degeneration. We know that two carotenoids other than lycopene, in the same category of phytochemicals, though, lutein and zeaxanthin are protective against age-related macular degeneration. Would you, I mean, could you speculate on that mechanism? Could it?
I can not only speculate, I can confirm what you're asking about, which is that both lutein and zeaxanthin, which are along with lycopene in the carotenoid family, they together they are what makes carrots orange and reddish, and bell peppers, and many reddish colored foods, or orange and red hued colored foods. They are all angiogenesis inhibitors. They all mow the lawn and kind of trim down the overage of blood vessels. So exactly to your point, that's one of the reasons, one of the explanations for why they actually prevent age-related macular degeneration, prevent those extra blood vessels from growing and leaking. And I was actually on a panel called the Global Ophthalmology Awards Program. So we're working with, probably, a dozen of the world's best eye specialists. And we discuss this topic often, how, the AREDS2 supplements that contain both of these carotenoids actually can be useful, but it's not just a supplement. You can also get these same carotenoids from the food that you eat.
Yeah, it's actually quite amazing. I'm a huge fan of carotenoids in general. So I guess, give us the overarching your overarching dietary philosophy. What are the kinds of things that we should be looking for when pushing our shopping carts through the supermarket? What are the kinds of, you could take it at the level of food category or individual foods that really excite you. And what are the kinds of foods that we should be steering clear from if we want to keep angiogenesis within a nice, healthy range in our bodies?
Yeah, we spent time talking about angiogenesis, but let me kind of back up for 1 second before I go into, kind of hyperspeed to kind of share with you how I think about shopping in a grocery store, for example, and what to choose and what to stay away from. First of all, when it comes to food and health, it's not just about the food. It's about how our body responds to what you put inside it. That's how, doctors think about drugs. Whatever you put into your body, there's going to have an effect in the body. And so, out there you hear all the marketing about this superfood or this super supplement. I can tell you there's no such thing as a single superfood or super supplement. If you want to call it something super, it's the human body. It's pretty awesome and amazing on what it can do. And what it can do best, better than anything else, and what we inherited when we kind of emerged from our mom's womb, is the ability to resist disease. It is a result of your body's hardwired health defense systems that we're born with. From the day we're born to our very last breath, we've got at least 5 health defense systems that I write about in my book, Eat to Beat Disease. Angiogenesis, our circulation, is one of our health defense systems. Good circulation, good health. Out of control circulation, cancer, macular degeneration, et cetera, et cetera. Second health defense system is our stem cells that are in our bone marrow that can come flying out to regenerate our organs slowly every single day. We're actually repairing and replacing ourselves, regenerating, not like a salamander or a starfish, like we can't grow back an arm or a leg, not yet. But one of the things that we can do is we can replenish aging and kind of like slightly kind of worn out organs. And in the same way that foods can actually cut off extra blood vessels and grow good ones, there are certain foods that can actually help prompt and recruit stem cells into the circulation to be able to help accelerate our regenerative properties. Like foods that can cause regeneration is quite an amazing concept. Our microbiomes, our third health defense system, our healthy gut bacteria. A lot of people talk about the microbiome, and it's one of the pillars, 5 pillars of my concept that I talk about in terms of healthy food, because the foods that we eat can either harm our microbiome, our gut bacteria, which then harms our immune system, harms our brain neurotransmitter system, harms our ability to heal. Okay, our bacteria really control a lot of these, influence a lot of these healthy systems. And if you feed the bacteria with things that they like, you nurture your bacteria like you'd feed your dog or your cat or your bird, and you treat them well, your bacteria become really vibrant, and they actually help our brain and our immune system and lower inflammation and help our metabolism. Fourth one's our DNA, fourth health defense system, which we think it's, everybody thinks of genetic code as DNA. Turns out our DNA protects us against the environment in ways that we hadn't even thought about. For example, you're pumping gas. If you still drive a gas car, I always ask people, do you stand upwind or downwind of the pump? And people look at me and say, well, why are you even asking that question? And I say, if you can smell the fumes of the gasoline, you are standing downwind. And those solvent vapors in your lungs are causing DNA mutations. Why don't you get lung cancer right away or the next day? Because your body's DNA is protecting your health by fixing itself when it's damaged. You're out there in traffic, with the window down on a sunny day in the summertime, you're not lying out on the beach, you're not in the sun tanning booth, but you are getting that sun on your arm. That's causing DNA damage on your skin. So how come you don't get skin cancer only in your left arm when your arm's out the window? Because the DNA is being fixed. So foods, you can eat foods, including carotenoids, that can help speed up your DNA fixing itself. And so that's really, when you ask about what's my framework, my concept, it's not only about the food, it's about how your body responds to it. So there's no single food. In fact, I write about more than 200 foods that you can easily find in the grocery store. Most of them in the perimeter of the grocery store, in the fruits and plant-based section, but also in the seafood section for those people who actually still eat seafood. And although we were told to avoid the middle aisle, it turns out that there's a lot of really good things in the middle aisle. Beans, whether they're dried or canned, tree nuts, really great for the microbiome. It's got good healthy fats. Olive oil, right? There's certain olive oils, 3 varietals, monovarietals from Italy, Spain, and Greece. I can tell you what they are: the Cornecchi, the Moriolo, and Picciolo olives. If you can get monovarietal olive oils, they have the highest levels of cancer-starving anti-angiogenic polyphenols. So I have a great time going into the middle aisle. I'm very selective. I ignore all that ultra-processed stuff and the candy bars and the weird colored chips, but I know what I'm going for. And so really my whole philosophy is know what you like, what you love to eat, know where it's located at the grocery store. When you get in that store, make a beeline for it. Kind of ignore all the marketing stuff. Go for the carrots if you like the carotenoids, or the red bell peppers, or the kale, or radicchio. Like I love that kind of stuff. And then if you're going to go into the middle aisle, make sure you've got some good healthy oils. You got some nuts and beans and all those kinds of things that are good for you. Spices, dried spices, also good for you.
I love that. It sounds like the dietary pattern that you recommend is pescatarian. Is like a sort of Mediterranean pescatarian hybrid. Would that be an accurate statement?
My approach is really flexible. So if you're pescatarian, it works. If you're vegetarian, it works. If you're a vegan, it works. And if you are somebody who is an omnivore and you eat pretty much everything, what I tell you is that if you spend most of your time eating foods that actually build up your health defense systems, the stuff that's not so good for you that you should ignore. So what are those? Eating a lot of red meat, which you should cut down or cut out. Eating ultra processed foods, taking in sugar sweetened beverages, and also eating artificial sweeteners. Those things are definitely not good for your health defenses. Like the research has shown, they take down and damage angiogenesis, stem cells, microbiome, impair your DNA, and they take down your immunity as well. So there are clearly things that actually are not so good for you to eat, not so much because they're intrinsically evil, but when you put them in your body doesn't respond well to them.
What would you say is the primary problem, or maybe there are more than one, with red meat? Is it the saturated fats in
Yeah,
it?
so it's a great question. Everybody tries to pin things on saturated fats, and there's a controversy now about saturated fats. Some people say they're not necessarily as bad as they're not. You don't want to demonize them. They play their role as well. I think that part of the issue about a heavy meat diet is really the overage of eating meat, and by the way, that meat is treated in factory farming. Also doesn't actually help the quality of the meat, the antibiotic laced foods, meats, the way they're treated. And because some animals are actually fattened up with steroids and other, artificial things, you're not really getting a pure food. You're getting a doctored food in a way that's not so good for you. We do know, by the way, that eating preserved meats, which I didn't put on my list, but not just red meat, but preserved meats, the deli meats, the things that we probably all grew up with, as kids, you get a piece of bologna, you put it between two pieces of white bread and put some, artificial mayonnaise on. Everybody has had that experience, right? At least in this country, that kind of experience. And we know that artificial processed meats are actually rated by the World Health Organization as a carcinogen. And all the data shows that people who eat a lot of processed meats. I'm not talking about the naturally processed meats, like the salamis and things hanging in the air in Italy or Sardinia. I'm talking about the mass-produced stuff that you get at the grocery store. That's not good for you. And so I think that let's focus. This is what I tell people. Let's focus on the things that you love that are good for you.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
And it's important for people to realize that if you can staple your stomach and lose weight, you can starve yourself and lose weight, you can cabbage soup diet and lose weight, but none of those things are really long-term sustainable or pleasurable. And the key is by focusing on well-being and health, you start to reset all the systems in your body to move towards reduced inflammation and better metabolism and improved energy and so forth.